Welcome back to Data Driven Leadership. I'm your host, Jess Carter. On today's episode, we're going to dive into data-driven patient care. And specifically what we're looking at is how we can use data in a more meaningful way to actually improve patient outcomes. To help me talk through this is Hannah Anderson, a lecturer at the University of Kentucky's Physician Assistant Program. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you.
Now, Hannah, you have to unpack for me and remind me again, you do have alphabet soup after your name. So walk me through, how are you trained? Where are you trained? Some of your background.
So I have, of course, a bachelor's from Taylor University. And then PA programs are master's degree programs. And so after college, I went on to get a 2.5-year master's degree program, which involves about 1.5 years of didactic training. And then our program is a year of clinical rotations, but a lot of, programs vary. And so it's Master's of Science in Physician Assistant Studies. And then the PAC is Physician Assistant Certified. So, a lot of people wonder that. My grandmother never remembers that. Every time she sees a PA, now tell me what those letters stand for. So every time.
You have some of the best stories that I've ever heard in regards to boots on the ground patient care. And so part of me was like, could I put you on the spot to think about a scenario? And I don't know, like in my head, I was like, it'd be cool to hear you say, here's a scenario I was in where like protocol, like you can demonstrate what you think, right? Like that whole process where you're like, if I would have just listened to the protocols, this would have happened. But I had to, I don't know, like, do you have something you can pull out for that?
So but my background is in trauma and general surgery. So when I first graduated PA school, that's what I was doing. One of the most time-consuming things is discharging a patient and writing their prescriptions and then getting them ready for them. So one of the things that the EMR incentives would do is have these pre-written prescription amounts. But this is not specific to the hospital I was in. I mean, this was an industry practice that really did makes paperwork so much more efficient. And if you can think of it from a quality patient care standpoint, the more streamlined a discharge is and the paperwork is, the more quickly I can get to your bedside to talk to you about what we're doing today or how sick you are. So part of the efficiency is these pre-filled prescription amounts, and we had certain ones that were they're pre-approved because all of the doctors had to agree on this dose. When I first started with the trauma service, it was the same for every person discharged. You could have a broken femur, you could have a broken wrist, you could have a broken nose. All of these things, and I think in the lay world, all of that is like, oh my gosh, of course you need pain medicine. Well, sure, but do you need 2 weeks worth of opioids? No. Now, will you have patients that say, yes, I do? Absolutely. Almost every single patient was so happy to go home with more than enough pain medication. And then you start to see the evolution of the opioid crisis, which was not subtle. And we quickly started to reevaluate how often we would use that preset prescription selection. And there's no fault of theirs. Until this point in history, we didn't have this big problem where people were selling them or abusing them. So this was a very new need that needed to be addressed. And it called for a change of literally a setting in the electronic medical record. A few of us started to say we need to change this. And there was a lot of tension over whether or not it needed to be changed. And you have a lot of patient pushback of, I don't have enough, or what if I need more? And there was a massive culture shift in seeing patients in clinic and getting phone calls. I need more. And you don't, you're scared. And we understand being scared, but also understand that after a few days of persistent opioid therapy, your risk increases dramatically. And so, I mean, it's even being revisited, whether or not, I think it was Medscape recently, but that may be incorrect, that put out an article about even moderate operations are being considered for non-opioid appropriate procedures. So like you have your gallbladder out, you have a hernia repaired, those are surgeries, they're real operations, but do they really need opioids? Can we just go back to ibuprofen?
I had this moment of like realization with my first kiddo was it was like the day after I had her, and I'd never even experienced, I mean, it sounds silly, but again, I've been mostly outpatient. So I'd never experienced someone asking me my pain on a scale, right? So you're sitting in a room and somebody's like, where are you on the scale of 1 to 10? At least back in 2019, that's what I was asked. And I remember being like, it's like a 3. And they were like, are you sure? Because you look miserable. You seem like you're in a severe amount of pain. And I was like, I mean, I'm not thrilled. And they were like, at some point, it was like, you have to say 7. We can't give you what you need unless you say 7. And I was like, this doesn't, like, how do you measure pain? This doesn't feel like a great way to be like, what if I don't think it's, to me, 7 is like, I'm bleeding out, I'm going to die, and I need morphine on the, like on a battleground somewhere. Like, to me, that's not what I was, but I felt way better when I said 7 and they gave me something. So I think even like how we measure pain and how we learn to talk about pain. Like you've said some interesting things to me in the past about, I'd never thought about the history of pain medicine, that like it hasn't been around for 100 years or 2000. And what did that look like? And to your point about having pain meds that we can go grab in our, in our closets upstairs when we're, or whatever. Some of that is just stuff I'd never really thought through until you kind of brought it up to me.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people are scared of opioids because of the opioid crisis. And that's also sad to me because they have their role. It's a very short term and acute role in many cases, but that's not a great way to train your brain to cope with pain. It's so comforting to have guidelines. It's so comforting to be told when to say yes and no, when to have your pre-filled prescription amount. But you have to, at some point, take on the responsibility of being a healthcare provider and consider your patient, consider your resources. What is our prognosis? What's our timeline? I mean, there's so much to be considered, which is why in teaching PA students, we're not teaching them to read guidelines only. We're teaching them learn the guidelines and learn medicine, because a computer can follow guidelines. You're not a computer. Your computers don't treat people. Now we're learning AI even has its own biases. So that are actually growing exponentially because we give them the bias when we create them. We have to think, we have to discern. And I think as soon as you stop being challenged by that is when maybe you're comfortable in practice, but patients are not improving.
So, I mean, what you're describing, and the reason I wanted to talk to you on this podcast is because I think what you're demonstrating too is how do you apply discernment and data-driven leadership in a medical industry, in the medical industry. How do you understand that there's data everywhere? You're drowning in data now, when you're right, 20 years ago you weren't. You were begging for research that took 20 to 40 years to produce, and then you leveraged that for another decade or two. And so it's like it's a completely different world where you want to leverage the data, but you have to be discerning and you have to understand. So this may be I'm probably deliberately asking a impossible question, but I am curious if you have any nuggets. How do you teach PA students that?
Well, that's a great question. Again, very specific to my opinion at this point because I'm a very new lecturer. I think so much of it comes into who are you accepting into the program? Who seems like they're ready for that challenge? Because it's a tremendous challenge. Well, I think that what maybe is taken lightly is the call to, I'm going to say it this way that I realize maybe not everyone agrees with, but I think that going into medicine should be answering a call to service in your heart. I think if somebody cares for people in such a way that they want to be part of helping them get better, and that that can be interpreted in a variety of ways, but I think that is what needs to be part of your foundation if you're really going to learn constructive discernment. I think that, well, by definition, discernment I think is constructive, but I think it's hard to know if you are discerning or deciding. So I think that plenty of people can decide things, and it's not necessarily for the betterment of those around them. But if you're discerning what is best for a patient, I think a lot of knowledge, a lot of practice, and a lot of heart goes into that. I really do.
Well, it sounds like you're starting at that point of who is in it for some sort of, dare I say, purpose, the sense of purpose. And I do think that, like I'm in, we may hang out, but you're in medical, I'm in tech. And so for me, I mean, that's the same. We're trying to debunk the same thing. We've got amazing people who are unbelievable at technology, unbelievable at science and engineering and whatever, developers that can, develop robots that go to Mars, right? Like it's like incredible what they're capable of, but it is different to be exceptional at your trade and to be a good discerning leader. And so where we struggle is we get people that are 15 years into their exceptional trade. And it's like, but did we stop and ever uncover or encourage or demand that if you wanted to grow, you had to grow in discernment and leadership skills? Like you had to understand how to listen and coach other people and read the room and do some of these things that are very much soft skills, but essential to leadership. And so I think in a lot of ways, though they're wildly different industries, there's the similar challenge. And what's interesting to me is in your profession, you're pretty much training everyone you talk to is going to be a leader. They're going to be coming through your program. They're going to make discernments decisions. They're going to go lead and take care of people. And so, that's just the bar has to be pretty high, I imagine. On they have to come in and demonstrate some ability or some interest or some purpose-filled desire to be coached in some of those ways, right?
Oh yeah. Well, and I say all of my, compassion based ideas, understanding that once we are out in the world as healthcare providers, as PAs, and you have administrative or otherwise pressure on you, whatever can handle stress the least gets squashed out first. So if it's your time with the patients, if it's your ability to go research the most recent guidelines or data, whatever it is, it gets squashed. And so some people really don't have a choice but to find what they think is the best possible way and then just do that over and over and over. And so I really think from like a future of medicine standpoint, we have a growing problem that we have more data to take in, more ways to provide data informed care, and less opportunity to do so. The more sort of the healthcare system evolves, the more burnout we see. I can't tell you how many friends are ER docs who are no longer full time because they are so burnt out and overworked. Primary care people, I mean, if you see your primary care person and you're like, well, they only gave me so much time. Yeah, because you know how many people they're seeing today? 30, 50, depends on the practice. So they only have so much time to write your note. Are you frustrated that you're not getting a nice, detailed, chunky note in your patient portal? Well, it's because they don't have the time. So, you have to choose where your time goes. And so I don't want to, for all the healthcare providers out there listening, I don't want to sound like I'm totally disregarding the pressure and the grind that is care. It is patient care. So I think one of the crises that we're facing is how do we keep up with the best, most recent, most reliable data that will optimize our care versus taking in the 10 most recent articles on tobacco cessation guidelines. You can't read all of that. I mean, unless you don't sleep, which that is some people's answer. I mean, some people really don't sleep, but then are you a healthy person? Are you somebody that should be making medication decisions? I mean, there are superheroes out there and they can do all of this and still provide excellent care. Anyways, I say that because as ideal as this whole world of let's get the best data to the providers and we're going to keep changing with it, as ideal as that is, for most people it isn't feasible. It's just not a realistic balance to strike. And so the looming question is what is the best way to help providers stay informed, stay excellent, and manage the pace of
Well, and that
practice?
might lead us into patient informed care, maybe. And I literally am, I'm not going to propose what that is. I'm going to have you explain it. But I imagine maybe a little bit too of like, how do we empower patients? And so there's part of me too that's like, I'm sure your dream patient is somebody that comes in and has, what was the challenge like 10 years ago? Everyone was like, like Google searching their symptoms and walking in with like a Wikipedia diagnosis, and they said, I know I have this. And I'm sure that's like your favorite thing. Yeah, WebMD. That's what it is. That's what it is. I WebMD'd my symptoms, and I think I have a hernia. You're like, okay.
Yeah. You know, the nice thing is, as a provider, if you Google something, you really don't get the answers you need. You need to know the specific way to search or to a Google Scholar review. But I think what's comforting about that is that if a patient had enough knowledge that they could search for a similar thing, they're going to get vague enough results that they still have to call their provider. Because, you know, from a safety standpoint, you're like, you should not be trying to do
Right.
this
And
at
even if you
home.
can figure it out, you need a diagnosis or support. So you still have to call us.
Yeah. Yeah. So call. Patient informed care, I think, is excellent. I think I'm trying to think of what show it was. Oh, it was on Parks and Rec when, or no, it wasn't. I'm sorry. It was on The Office. And it's when Pam has her baby and the nurse comes in to check on her and she says something like, oh no, don't give her a pacifier in the nursery. I don't want her having nipple confusion. I read all about that. And the nurse says, oh
And
good,
she
you're
does like
one
the
of
side eye
those.
to the camera. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the problem with that is usually that it takes away trust from the provider. You know, if somebody says like, oh, I have an idea of what this is, then, or like what I'm experiencing, but what do you think? You know, if the trust is still there, then it's a very constructive thing. But I think if you have, which often you do, have patients coming in that don't trust you and they feel like they have to defend themselves. But it's still part of that vicious cycle. Like they have to defend their time in your office because they know you're stressed and you're going to be brief and you're going to assume things to make care easier. And so it's not because the person coming in to see you doesn't care usually. It's because they have, you know, 10 other patients actively in the office waiting for them or, you know, stuff like that. So there is hope in the medical system. It's just, I think, a tension filled moment right now where patients feel vulnerable but overwhelmed with information and possibilities, and providers are overwhelmed with information but want to stick with what they know, which is safe.
Well, and I feel like as a parent, I feel like I text you whenever I take my kids anywhere because there's this concern of, do I need to advocate for anything? Like, is this just a normal visit and it's fine? And my kid has strep again, or my kid just has a cold, or there's something normal going on. But like, is there any little tiny thing that if I paid attention to it and voiced it, someone would be like, wait a minute, what? And so there's this desire of like, for my own care, I might go 2 years before I check into like, hey, sometimes when I stretch my back, I feel a tweak. Like, what's going on there? But when it's my kids, I'm like, hold on. Like, they can't adequately advocate for themselves and discern exactly what's a 9 on a scale of pain or something. And so I think that amplifies it for me too, of like, hey, I gotta advocate. It's not just like I trust. It's like there's a little bit of trust but verify going on. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel that. I mean, you know, healthcare providers talk about that, you know, everybody goes through this sort of, I mean, they say healthcare providers are the worst patients or nurses are the worst patients because, you know, you like come in, you've already decided what you have. And well, one day I'll forget, but for now, I don't forget that I had a sore throat one time. And, you know, my background is trauma. I'll say that in general surgery. But I mean, I feel like I'm pretty sharp on most topics still. But, you know, everybody has like this little blind spot every once in a while, especially when it's for yourself. And so I had a sore throat and I went in to be seen. And I was like, well, I have a virus or I have strep. That's it. And the doctor I saw looked at my throat and said, well, you have a tonsillar ulcer, which like those happen. They just happen. I totally forgot they exist. I was so embarrassed. I was so embarrassed. I was like, I should have known that that was what was going on. But I just had convinced myself that I had strep throat and I needed to make sure I wasn't going to give it to our kids or like spread it at work or I had a virus. And, you know, I just needed to make sure. No, it was a tonsillar ulcer. I felt so silly. But yeah, there are those kinds of moments where you're like, oh, anytime I'm worried that I need to give the provider all of this information about me or my child, I've tried to practice reminding myself that non-healthcare provider patients come in every day, all day, and they get excellent care throughout the world. I trust that. I mean, obviously not excellent everywhere, but it's possible. And so is it possible that I would have something that gets missed and I'd be, one of those bad stories? Of course, but it's very unlikely. So I get in the car and drive every day and I don't freak out that I'm going to have a car accident. So I can go to the doctor and trust that I'll probably get good care. But it's really hard to take that step back because you go through the spiral of, well, what if I should tell what maybe that's relevant, but maybe it's not. But I should tell them anyways and let them decide. And but it's all, it's this like fear cascade. It could be worst case scenario. What if it is worst case scenario? Well, the only thing I can do is overreact just in case. Oh, well, just in case, just in case. And the brain is really good at fear.
Well,
We're
you're
very
like
good at
leading
fear.
me into this totally different topic, but it's something interesting that I was curious about too. I mean, part of me is also like, yeah, there's a lot of emotion involved in the medical field, and it's not just in the patients. Like, I don't know, like if I sat here and asked you, like, when's a time you got it wrong? When's a time that you used data, tried to discern, and then I was like, I don't even know if you could tell me, Hannah, like, because there's probably like somebody could sue you or something. Like, there's some of that where it's like there's probably people who are like, the medical community is not necessarily a place where it's easy and safe to fail, is my point. Right. So it's not like you call it practice because it is practice. It's not perfection, but there's not a lot of room for like, you didn't do great in your practice. Okay. Like just get better. Like try again next time is not exactly the environment we're in. And that probably amplifies some stress and some, I don't know, key factors where humans don't tend to perform at their best when they don't feel like there's any wiggle room, buffer, safety net. Right. I don't know. It's interesting to me.
Yeah, there is no wiggle room. You don't go, oops. No provider wants to, or no patient wants to hear their provider go, oops.
You want to feel like you're trusting them, and there's not a lot of room for error. If they get something wrong, you're like, I don't know that you're hanging out with that doctor for the next 20 years, right?
Right. I'm trying to think of, I mean, I can remember one time that did not cause any problems with the patient.
Oh, you're taking me on. You're taking the question on. I love this.
I am. I'm taking it on because I think it's important, but it still ties into fear. I mean, yeah. So I remember one time talking through a patient asked something about they wanted to see their rib fractures. And I'm all about if you've had imaging, that's your body. You should be able to see what's going on. And so often people would just accept what they were told as diagnoses, or they'd be so broken that by the time they come out of anesthesia and they're sort of waking up a few days later or weeks later, they don't know all of their injuries. And so it was an important process at some point to sit down with the patient and say, these are all your diagnoses. And often the follow up was, oh, well, I didn't know that. Can I see that? Where is that? And so I'd pull up images and talk through them. And this was when I was a very early PA. And I had pulled up, I think it was probably a CT scan or something. And I was explaining their rib fractures to them. And I had totally flipped the orientation of the images. So I was telling them that their fractures were over here on right or left. I was telling them that they were over on the right. And then it might have been the attending that came in or one of the fellows that came in while I was talking to them and corrected me that no, but before they came in, I remember the patient kind of getting this look on their face like, what? And the, fellow walks in and corrects me. No, those are on the left side. And I was so humiliated. And the patient said, oh, well, that makes sense. That's where I hurt. I was pretty confused that they were on the other side. And I was so humiliated and, I didn't make that mistake again. But you just like from a provider standpoint, the negative feelings are really fear that everyone will just think you're incompetent then. So if you make that mistake, what are the mistakes are you going to make? And oh gosh. And so that's a fear spiral. And yeah, so at some point we have to learn to mitigate our fear, look at what we know and do the best we can with compassion and excellence. I think that like when it comes down to it, you have to regroup somehow and go, what do I know? What are my resources? What am I looking at? What am I looking at can be all of the things. Who is the patient? where are they coming from? What's wrong? But yeah, I mean, it sounds simple when you just describe it that way, but it's not. But it's also not specific to medicine. I mean, in life, we have to learn to do that. And I don't even know if I want to call it trust, that everybody has to move forward with trust. I think it's just learning not to listen to fear. Just don't be ruled by fear. Because everybody has different things they might trust in, but try to be not ruled by fear.
I think the emotional description of fear for me that I just think most people can relate to is that spiral. You start spiraling out of control. You have 1,000 thoughts. You can't let go of them. You either can't go to sleep or you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it, or you can't let go of it. You're in a meeting and you can't focus because you're focused on the other thing that you can't let go of. And so to me, and maybe that's where I'm curious about, like, when did you learn, and this is a little bit abstract here as we kind of wrap up, but like, when did you learn how to stop the spiraling? And are these some of the processes and tools that were given to you where it's like, okay, like, it's not productive anymore to keep, like, it's actually accomplishing nothing to keep spiraling. But how do you get yourself out of those moments?
Well, I do think being a healthcare provider was a huge part of that because you can't stop. And you can't be ruled by it because the next person you're going to see, they need you. They need all of you fully present, fully engaged. And so you can't really have a day. You can't, you can't go, sorry. I mean, I know, you're like hemorrhaging in your belly, but I'm really stressed out about the encounter I just had. So you're going to need to take a minute.
In my world, it's the equivalent of when people ask you in interviews, like, so what do you do when how do you handle stress? And people are like, I go on a run. And I'm like, it turns out you can't go on a run in the middle of a failed prod go live or deployment. Like, it's not like, I'm stressed, let me go on a quick jog, I'll be back in an hour. That doesn't work.
Right. I think, well, and so, I mean, okay, just to get like a little bit crunchy granola on you, but I know you're here for it. So I think if you're not able to go inward and find some stability, then you're toast. I just, I mean, good luck. Yeah,
that is my favorite thing that anyone has said on the podcast yet, because somehow you just, while discussing how to get over fear spirals, induced a major fear in me of like, if you can't, you're toast.
I know. Just don't call me to do your motivational speeches. You're toast. No.
You're not probably
there's
wrong.
got to be a better way to say
so
that.
Funny.
No, well, okay. Yeah, I've got to find a more constructive way to share with people that I think we're so fast, whether you're in traffic, in medicine, in your workday, in your personal relationships, you move so fast that if you don't pause, the spiral is not stoppable. And I don't mean that like you will end up dead in 5 minutes, obviously, but I just mean that fear might dictate what you do. I think, I think it's pretty easy to say and hard to practice that if you aren't aware of sort of the beginning of that spiral, then you have a hard time putting the stick in the wheel and going, I am okay. I am breathing. I am present. This is my purpose here right now. And then move forward with that purpose.
But you're right. No. I think, Hannah, I actually think it was hilarious and astute, because there is a reality where it's like, hey guys, on earth, no one else is going to be enough for you to calm you down in the moments of fear. You have to be an adult and figure out how do you need breathing techniques? Do you need to close your eyes for a minute and just like stop with the stimuli visually, like pause for a minute? Like for me, everything felt like it was overwhelming at work, and work was my identity for a long time. And it took me a minute to be like, okay, I was like, I either need a therapist or a coach, maybe both. And I got on the phone with a coach and she was like, can you just find 30 seconds before, to your point, I was making decisions all the time. I wasn't discerning. And she's like, if you can just create 30 seconds where you think you're ready to make a decision, but you pause just for 30 seconds and really contemplate why you're making that decision, what data you have available, kind of stuff you've walked through, and then make it. You're probably not going to change your mind, but it was like I had to practice realizing that, like, when I got in the car, I didn't have to be efficient my whole life every minute. I could pause. And it actually, in reflecting, in processing for 5 minutes, I'd always get in the car and make a call because I'm trying to be efficient on my drive. And it was like, actually, if you stop and reflect on some things, you might have better ideas than the ones you have right now. And in 5 minutes, you can make a better decision because you taught yourself the skill of not hours of pausing, not hours of mindfulness, like minutes and seconds of pausing. And I can't believe what a difference it's made in my like abilities to just like when people like, and the number of people that come to me when they didn't before, probably because I reacted to everything versus now I'm seen as somebody who can like make you pause too and get somewhere better than where you are. But I didn't have those capabilities 2 years ago, like some of that's just through practice,
Yeah. Yeah, everybody has 30 seconds. Everybody has a minute, and I think what's important is you're not doing something else. I think from a leadership standpoint, if you are not managing your spiral, the people under you won't either. I think from a patient care standpoint, that's easy to say. Patients know when a provider is on edge and snippy and trying to get out of the room or not paying attention. I mean, I think we've all been in an office where somebody came in and never sat down and then left the room within 3 minutes. And from a patient advocacy standpoint, that is when I say, well, hang on, you can speak up. You are a human being with a voice. And you are allowed to say, no, I need the doctor back in here. I have more questions. I remember working with a doctor once who said, and this is not an uncommon practice, that I've been in the room once, I never go back in. So they can ask as many questions as they want through the nurse, but I will not go back in. And yeah, I would be curious what the rest of your relationships in your life look like. If that is how you treat people, then I think the evidence will speak for itself. So it's a little different kind of data. It's like subjective data being collected in the moment, but So anyways, yeah, I guess to pull together the tangent that I led us on, I think that I used to be really cynical about the idea that anybody can be a leader. And I mean, that was a very juvenile thought. And it was a pretty cocky thought. But like, not anybody can be a leader. I know what a leader is. Well, how many people was I leading? Nobody, because they were going, you got a bad attitude. We don't want to go where you're going. So, like, I think there are a lot of titles that really come with talent and skills and strategy. But treating human beings in your life is leading someone somewhere. So I definitely, I always underappreciated how much just being a healthcare provider was being a leader. If at minimum you're teaching someone that they're a valuable person, you're sitting down to look at them in the eyes and say what's wrong. I mean, that's tremendously important. And then hopefully you're trying to keep up on the data and do that well.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate some of these reflections because I think there's also something scary that happens. I hope not in healthcare, but in my world. And you said something different than this, but it reminded me of this too. Is what the other plague that befalls leaders, I think, at least in tech and consulting, because I've observed it firsthand, or in my clients or our own company, whatever, is if you don't know how to look inward, or else sometimes your team tries to do it for you. So now you have people where, if I was to apply it to your world, instead of worrying about the patient, you're worried about your boss. And like, that's not what anyone needs. And so that's where I think even in a leadership role, like, you got to learn how to take care of yourself. Because if you don't, you're at risk of being like, yes, leadership is lonely. Sure. Yes, leadership is super lonely. And I don't want to minimize that because I think it's really lonely. But I also think to know the difference between the stuff you can delegate and make sure you're not delegating leadership and you're not creating dependency on the people beneath you to be enough in your own role. Like, that is more energy they're wasting on you versus stuff they could be doing in my world for a client and your world for a patient. And like, let's make all of our energy spent on those people, you know? So anyway, well, okay. You have scratched every itch I've wanted to ask you in order to force you onto this podcast and talk to me. And so are there other tangents you want to go on or things that you want to discuss?
I guess I do want to speak to the fact that I've learned in education, the data-driven side of the world is going, how can we be unique? How can we, be different or inspect things that have not been investigated or challenge what has already been found? And that isn't the world that most of society wants to live in. That's terrifying. That's unsettling to not have reliable, peer-reviewed, published data. And so I think, there's the input and the output. And hopefully, I know I don't know anything about the business world really, but I hope that I've not squashed hope in the reliability of data outside of research, outside of the world of research development, I should
It's
say.
realistic, right? Like it would be a bit naive for people who are in data and tech all the time to assume somehow that the world in data is different and operates perfectly somewhere else. I mean, the reality, and it is scary sometimes to be like, when I started getting into government technology and consulting, I remember thinking, surely it doesn't work like this. Right. And then you're like, yeah, it turns out it's just like real human beings with real technology stacks and real challenges and real data about real human beings in the first place who all do things differently and behave differently. So it turns out insights are really hard to come by, and there's always caveats because we're trying to model after human beings and we're trying to solve for conditions that human beings have. And so in those worlds it's actually very similar, and so I think being realistic about those things is important.
When I recently had someone say to me that when he finished, he's a longtime surgeon who was licensed maybe 50 years ago, and almost 50 years ago. And he said that he was well into his career 30 or more years ago, the half-life of medical knowledge was approximately 7 years. And then he said, and he saw maybe a year ago that the half-life of knowledge is something like 30 some odd days. And I mean, he gave me specific numbers, but I'm not going to pretend to obviously remember them exactly. But 7 years to 30 days, I mean, textbooks don't have really they don't have a hope in a world like that. I mean, nobody's going to have information that lasts long enough to publish them if that's the rate that we keep growing in. I mean, that's not totally true. We have the bones in the body don't change, things like that. But
Thank God the bones in the body are not changing every 30 days.
oh my gosh.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Jess Carter. And don't forget to follow the Data Driven Leadership wherever you get your podcasts. Rate and review, letting us know how these data topics are transforming your business. We can't wait for you to join us in the next episode.